This is the Center for Religion in the City. The next stop is Contagion, Religion, and Cities. All right, welcome everyone to the first episode, Center for the Study of Religion and the City podcast. And today's social event is a remembrance of the Baltimore Uprising. And we are hoping to frame our remembrance around questions about environmental health and food sovereignty. We have two guests that we're really delighted and excited about having with us today. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown. Dr. Lawrence Brown is the author of this fabulous book, The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America, which I had great pleasure growing over the past couple of nights. And he's also the director of the Black Butterfly Project. Alongside Dr. Lawrence Brown, we also have Siobhan Terrell, who's the deputy director of the Black Church Food Security Network. So the goal over the next, I would say, half an hour will be the two of us, Amanda and I, to start a discussion, lead off a discussion with Dr. Brown and Siobhan, dominating the talking time, but to have everybody else in attendance to gain a sense of who they are, what work they do, and what kind of overlaps we have between the two of them. And then after that, I would say about a good 20 minutes, we will open up the floor to the participants to ask questions as well. You can send me questions via the chat room. Prefer doing that just because to keep the audio make sure there's no audio issues as we submit the recording online. So you can send in your questions over the chat room and I will, recognize you, use your name, and then say this person has the following question. And then at the end, there is going to be one of you will be lucky enough to actually win this book prize because I have a quiz directly from the book. Just a very basic one question. And whoever gets it right the quickest will be the winner of the book. So that's sort of the game plan here for the next hour. So I'll start off the discussion today. And what I'll try to do is actually share a screen because I kind of have a PowerPoint presentation to accompany the discussion. So let's see if I get this going. Okay, so I've already introduced the guest for today, and let me see, here it is. The Baltimore Uprising, for some of us are going to be Baltimore residents among the participants. Many of us are not. So this is just a moment to actually kind of learn more about the uprising. And my question, I think we can start off with Dr. Lawrence Brown is, Dr. Brown, could you describe to us how the uprising has influenced your work for our participants today?
Yes. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to talk to you all today. And even though we're talking about the uprising of April 27th, 2015, one thing I talk about in my book is how the first bloodshed in the Civil War took place during the Pratt Street riot in Baltimore on April 19th, 1861, which is going to be 160 years this April 19th. So Baltimore has had a legacy of rioting. As a matter of fact, when you think about the Boston Tea Party, that was a riot where American colonists were fighting for their freedom against the British Empire. So, Baltimore had a nickname, called Mob Town for the longest. Baltimore's had riots left and right. Rioting is pretty much as American as cherry pie and or apple pie. And so, I guess when I think about the April 27th version after the murder of Freddie Gray, it turned my life, I think, upside down just in terms of really trying to. I have been talking about a lot of the issues, segregation, police violence, but I think it sort of brought a lot of the issues just into sharp focus. Suddenly, people could not ignore, how all of these factors were playing a role. Everything from the school system to toxic lead exposure. Freddie Gray was poisoned with lead when he was a baby, just like his twin sister, and many other thousands of children in Baltimore. Stories came out about that in the news media. So it's just it really brought a lot of the issues that I was looking at into focus. And even a year after the April 27th, 2015 uprising, another Baltimore resident who had moved to Baltimore County, she grew up in Baltimore City, moved to Baltimore County, Corinne Gaines, she was shot and killed by the police in Baltimore County in her own home. And she was killed by the police, and then her son was hit by shrapnel, and both of them were lead poisoned. So, the uprising for me brought a lot of the issues related to red line black neighborhoods into focus. And that's why my book, I'm really talking about the fact that you cannot make Black Lives Matter if you don't make black neighborhoods matter.
Great. Siobhan, building on Dr. Brown's point about one of the great, I mean, as based on the reading I did, one of the great contributions of this work is that it spatializes the history of African American experience in the city, and with a particular focus on Baltimore. And I'll get back to you, Dr. Brown, about the white L and the black butterfly, the beautiful phrasing to spatialize and talk about how racial differences is all about space. Before I get back to you, Siobhan, could you describe how food security and food sovereignty has become such an important part of gaining sovereignty over your neighborhood, and how the neighborhood perhaps plays a role in designing of urban gardens. So, and again, it's kind of like impact of the uprising on the Black church food security networks, kind of building on the same question I asked Dr. Brown.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for that. So in preparing for this podcast, and I just want to thank you for the opportunity. This is my second podcast, and I am excited to be talking about the work of the Black Church Food Security Network. So in preparing for this, I have been like reading different community design and urban planning books. I got my master's in urban planning from Morgan State, so this was an opportunity to dust off those books, right? But a quote really stuck with me, and it says, "The purpose of community design is to create relationships between residents and not buildings. The ultimate goal to measure successful community design must be at which how often it brings people together and the forms of how it brings people together." And I think the community design of Baltimore City is not doing that, right? Martin Luther King say, uprising and protest is the voice of the unheard. So in that moment, like, what were they saying? And a lot of people were saying that we need food. And that's how the Black Church Food Security Network was founded, because during that time, food was used as a political weapon. So when community residents were protesting for rights, protesting for equality, at the same time, the different governmental structures, such as the MTA, cut off the bus transportation lines. And that was the primary source. Public transportation is a primary source that many people depend on to acquire food or to get to those grocery stores in order to acquire food. So during that time, many communities were without food. And that's how the Black Church Food Security Network actually began. Like, the start is because the community residents reached out to Dr. Brown, who is the pastor of Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, who has been growing food at his church since 2011. And they reached out to see, is he able to donate some of the food to those communities that were without? The community garden is small. It's 1,100 square feet, and it grows 1,200 pounds of produce on a yearly basis. And that by no means is enough to feed an entire community, right? So what he did was he partnered with farmers on the Eastern Shore of Maryland to transport some of the produce that they have that's not being sold in those mainstream markets, to then distribute to the communities that were without food during that time. And the church kind of served as a food hub and a medium of transportation during that time. So we empowered our community and our churches to like reimagine their assets for community food security. And I guess as the conversation go on, I can talk more about like food apartheid and the structural issues that went into shaping why communities are without food in the first place.
Great. So Dr. Brown, question for you to educate our audience members. If you could offer a bit of historical background to the formation of the white L and the black butterfly, this great phrasing that really helps us understand Baltimore. For many of us who are not actually from Baltimore, you know, just if you could offer a bit of how this white L and black butterfly came to appear in the designing of the city. And then in response, Siobhan, could you then talk about, after Dr. Brown's response, the ways in which the Black Church Food Security Network is able to perhaps, you know, resist or and kind of unsettle or decenter this rigid boundary race built on the urban landscape of Baltimore. So Dr. Brown, you first.
Sure. Well, I was looking at this very map. It's a racial dot map, one dot per person by Dustin Cable, who was at the University of Virginia. Actually, you can look it up online. I believe the Cooper Center still has it up. And, you know, looking at them, and it didn't have that boundary of Baltimore, the bold black line around it. So I said, well, let me draw that in there because I like putting maps on social media. And as soon as I put that boundary of Baltimore around it, I was like, whoa, that, you know, the green dots, which represent Black Baltimoreans, that looks like a butterfly. And so I started calling it the Black Butterfly. And then the blue dots represent white people in Baltimore, white residents. And so I said, well, that's the white L that, you know, folks had talked about before. And so, in fact, Baltimore is a Category 5 hyper-segregated city. And just like a hurricane, Category 5 is the most intense, most devastating form of segregation that we have. It inflicts tremendous damage on Black neighborhoods and the residents that live in those neighborhoods. But in 2015, when I came up with Black Butterfly, I was thinking about Kendrick Lamar's album To Pimp a Butterfly. And I was thinking about how that metaphor of how something so beautiful could be exploited. And I thought that it was going to be, I knew it was going to be a counter narrative. I knew that by calling it the butterfly, Black Butterfly, that it would work against the primary notion that nothing good comes out of the hood, you know, and it would actually counteract the notion that we don't need to spend and allocate resources in Black neighborhoods. And you notice I avoided the word invest because I think that has capitalist overtones and you're looking for a return. And when it comes to public goods, you're not looking for a return. You spend money on roads, libraries, you know, housing, because these are things that people need to thrive and survive. So that's not an investment. That's what you do when you're a city to make neighborhoods flourish. And so that was my thinking, that it needed to be a counter narrative that lifted up Black neighborhoods. And, you know, Baltimore is one of 8 Category 5 hyper-segregated cities. So the other 7 are Chicago, Flint, Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Birmingham, and Cleveland. So those are Baltimore's sister cities that are in the most devastating category of racial segregation that we have in America. And then Category 4, you have cities like New York City, Rochester, New York, Kansas City, Houston, Miami, those type of cities that are, well, Miami, I believe, is category, and Houston are Category 3. So, you know, different cities fall in different categories. But, you know, based on the cities that I named, you can tell that those Category 5 cities definitely we recognize them. They're dealing with violence, lead poisoning, water crises. They're dealing with all homicide rate through the roof. So it makes sense once you understand that Baltimore is a Category 5 hyper-segregated city.
Siobhan?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yes, my question is, could you talk about the ways in which the Black Church Food Security Network is able to contest or destabilize this rigid boundaries within Baltimore of the white L and the black butterfly? How does food move around? Because you already brought up the rural farmers in Eastern Maryland. So you talked about space in ways that is a little more dynamic, and there's a lot of food is moving from one particular urban garden to the rural areas. And so I just wanted to kind of get the audience member get more of a sense of just to map the circulation of this food. Where are we distributing, who's receiving, who's cultivating, and to just kind of like, just talk a little bit more about what you had already started speaking about.
Yeah, definitely. I wish I could just add like a couple of more maps to this slide, right? Because you can't talk about segregation in Baltimore. You can't talk about the lack of resources that's found in Black neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods being redlined without taking it back to like the 1940s, right? When the homeowner loan corporation drew this map, this redlining map. And that's the first map I would want to show, like this redlining map, and to show that the Black neighborhoods that were redlined today are the ones that are considered healthy food priority areas today. Where neighborhoods that was redlined then are considered healthy food priority areas today. And then there's another map that I would want to add, right? And that other map would be a map of neighborhoods that are hyper-policed. And those are the neighborhoods that were redlined. Those are the neighborhoods that are healthy food priority areas. And those are the same neighborhoods that are being hyper-policed. So just back to the point, the first question is just like, Black residents and Black Baltimoreans are fighting multiple epidemics. As Dr. Lawrence Brown mentioned, it's like we are fighting the lead epidemic. We are fighting different public health inequities, right? The life expectancy being so much more less in Black communities as in comparison to Roland Park, a neighborhood that was considered not a redlined neighborhood, a neighborhood that was a restricted covenant during that time and created specifically for white residents, and that's where the resources flow. So if you want to talk about where food resources are flowing, they're flowing in the same direction as the other resources flowing in the city, right? And we define that problem as being food apartheid. And food apartheid is the systemic self-destruction of Black self-determination to control where our food comes from and to control the food that's on our plate. So what does that look like in Baltimore City? That looks like an oversaturation of fast food restaurants, corner stores with a low healthy food availability index. That also looks like these food retail outlets within our neighborhood not selling culturally appropriate food. That also looks like predatory marketing, right? We see these large signs, these large McDonald's signs, like we see these large 25-cent, 50-cent soda signs, right? And then those marketing strategies impact the health outcomes of our community. So there is so much like overlap between the map that was drawn in the 1940s to the healthy food priority area map that is today. And we tend to not call it healthy food priority areas or food deserts, right? Because as I mentioned, policy decisions, different powers at B went in place into shaping these communities. It did not happen by chance, and it did not happen by force of nature, but instead it happened by different policy implications and ramifications of discriminatory policy in Baltimore.
If I might elaborate on what my colleagues just said, in 1910, Baltimore was the first city to deploy residential racial zoning. On December 19th, the mayor, John Barry Mahul, he passed the first residential racial zoning law in America. And not too long after, 6 years later, St. Louis passed it also, but by referendum. So Baltimore was exporting its way of segregating what were called Negroes or colored people, Black people at the time. They were sharing how to do it with other cities like St. Louis, Richmond, Virginia, with the next mayor, James Preston. And then also the Roland Park Company in 1912, they deployed community-wide racially restrictive covenants for the first time. And so in that map you're looking at, north central Baltimore, you're seeing neighborhoods like Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, a little bit to the west, you have Mount Washington. So these are communities that deployed restrictive covenants. that use racial zoning to keep Black people out. So that's how the white L, Hamden was known as a nest for the Ku Klux Klan, a little further south than that L. So it's that way. And this was copycatted and used in cities across America, but Baltimore was really ground zero.
One of the great contrasts between the hyper concentration of the fast food restaurants that Siobhan, you mentioned, is this beautiful image of the urban garden. I know, Amanda, you have a question about arts and aesthetics. And also, I think that would apply perfectly well with Dr. Brown, your concept of the butterfly, which is a beautiful thing to see. And anyways, it's visually beautiful. So we're gonna kind of talk about aesthetics and arts. And Amanda, I think I'll let you formulate the question for the two of them.
Okay, yeah, I'm the art person, so yeah. And I think we've both been dealing with it, or we keep hitting on this point about, I think that the divides, the divisions are happening on an aesthetic level. And what I mean by that is, and I think that this is, my question was regarding basically the design of cities, because historically, I think cities have often given preference to kind of masculine notions of industrialization, efficiency, these things, and often relegated things commonly associated with feminine, like aesthetics and beauty, and kind of not had considered those into the design of cities. And as a result has led to divisions that are framed around things like smell, taste, sight, and so one of the things I wanted to ask you, Siobhan, just kind of follow up, is how do you see the Black Church Food Security Network redressing these aesthetic divisions or these aesthetic divides, as you were talking about? Like, for example, something like smell. Like going through a city, they call themselves food capitals, yet when you oftentimes, like just when I'm in St. Paul, I rarely get the opportunity to smell fresh herbs. And it's incredible what the smell of like savory herbs can do for you. Just and in terms of, because this also I think relates to environmental health, something that keeps coming back up in the conversations I'm noticing. So I'm wondering, Siobhan, if you could speak more to that and talk a little bit more about how you see the role of aesthetics in Baltimore and things that the Black Church Food Security Network is doing.
That's a great question. And I've never been asked a question like that before.
You know me, I'm the art person. I'm as my students will say, I'm all about touch and smell and the feel.
Yeah. I mean, that question instantly got me thinking about planning with communities, right? Mm-hmm. Because like when I think about smell, like I think about foods that are relevant, like to my upbringing and relevant to my culture, right? Like certain smells come to mind. Like I see watermelon, right? Because my uncle used to grow watermelon every summer, and every time I used to go over there, we used to have to eat them almost every day, like a half of it, right? And I think that is so important in embracing the fullness of the people that you're in partnership with, right? That our mission is to co-create community-based food systems that's anchored by the resources that are found within the Black community, and specifically Black culture, to create food systems that are equitable and community-centered to thus advance sovereignty, right? And food sovereignty is centering the people at the heart of the food system rather than at the demands of corporations and big businesses. So that's allowing people to define what their food system looks like. And I think centering in that really gets to like the cultural appropriateness of food and what is acceptable. Because I'm seeing now, like in this pandemic, there are so many like food charity efforts that's happening. And someone in a panel that I was on a couple of weeks back, right, they was like, we have boxes of produce, right? But it's all going to waste. Why? And I'm like, that shouldn't be the question, right? The question should be, how can we engage in the community to ensure that we're supplying the food that's relevant to their palate, that's relevant to their diet, that's relevant to their culture? So I think speaking to that need, one, and then also back to food sovereignty, and in the spirit of mutual aid, is working with the community and not working for them or working or doing this to them, right? And I think we just got to get back to the approach of like, we are all in community together, and we are building up our food systems to sustain each other, and we're not doing it for one another, but we're doing it to advance food sovereignty. So I think hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Just centering the humanness of people and centering culture and design planning and space making.
Yeah, no, definitely. It sounds like the aromas of, fresh vegetables and herbs that are part of a cultural traditions, things like sage and things like that, is wafting out the aromas through Baltimore. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think 100. Yeah. And I think to follow that up, Dr. Brown, I think, so you brought up environmental health a lot. I keep hearing that come up. I wonder, and I didn't even know when you mentioned Freddie Gray and lead poisoning. I didn't know that. That's something that I didn't even consider. So I wonder if you could speak more about what you see are the key environmental health challenges and how you see the city of Baltimore trying to redress those.
Well, actually, it relates to your question, which is, the first question you asked my esteemed colleague around, environmental justice and, you said herbs, but I think about green infrastructure and how in red line communities, people are denied, urban tree canopy, shrubs, flowers. You can go to a public housing community and not see, beautiful landscaping or, trees. I think Olivia Robinson did a study a few years ago, and she looked at like the tree growth in the map that Siobhan mentioned, which is the residential security map from 1937 that has those four colors: red, blue, yellow, and green. Most people talk about red with red lining, but she looked at all four colors and she saw that the tree heights for trees in those four color communities corresponded. Green was the best, and green, or in terms of access to capital, and it had the trees had the highest heights in those communities. Red is the community that had the lowest access to capital, and the trees were the shortest in those communities. So that meant that a lot of those trees had been cut down. There were fewer trees and they didn't have the same height. So it's just like when you think about things like urban tree canopy, which contributes to the urban heat island effect, it can be 10 degrees hotter in a red line community because they don't have shade. They don't have the trees, covering the landscape, and therefore, people are hotter. And then because they're lower income, they don't have AC in the summer. And you're talking about people dying with heat strokes and things of that nature. You're talking about urban flooding because sewer systems aren't maintained the same way. So you have that when these, climate change is inducing all kinds of extreme weather events. So that's inducing urban flooding. You'll see, like, especially downtown and in and around older areas of the city during the summer, there's going to be like this flooding events that you see periodically. So, green infrastructure, for me, green infrastructure, sewers, the way that the infrastructure of the city is built out, plays a major role. And with green infrastructure in particular, I think I've come to the conclusion that when people don't have access to green space, trees, flowers, shrubs, you're actually disconnecting them from their creator, because that's their ability to go and see and commune with, the different things that the creator has put on this planet. If you're living in asphalt and concrete, you don't see trees and beautiful flowers. You're losing, the sense of how human beings are connected with nature. And so I think that's the thing. Redlining is connected with green apartheid. And I think it's that connection. So then those aromas you're going to smell the sewage overflows. You're going to smell the alleys that aren't being cleaned the same way. You're going to smell trash. You're going to smell rats and whatever else is going through there. But you're not smelling the beautiful foliage of the forest of the trees, because you don't have that in your neighborhood. And so I think, when I think of aromas, I'm thinking of what are people exposed to because there's a lack of green infrastructure in redline Black neighborhoods.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you for the great last 10 minutes. I'm sorry, there was a dog barking while Siobhan was describing the smell
Sounds
of
of the
herbs. We
city.
had to all endure the sounds of a dog bark. And I completely forgot I could mute myself. I don't know why I've been muting everyone else, but I forgot to mute myself. So, but to build on this is the last question from us, and then we move to the participants. Alongside modernity created this binary between nature and culture, and kind of goes along with the binary between man and woman. So one question I had was to end with, is to talk about Black motherhood. And I will just frame it as this: what is the role of Black motherhood in reclaiming the right to the city, a city that is enmeshed with nature and allows for that kind of beautiful smells that Dr. Brown and Siobhan, you guys mentioned? If both of you could just say a little bit about the importance of Black motherhood.
Siobhan, if you want to speak to that first.
Yeah, I can go first. So, in regards to the Black church community, Black women are the backbone of the Black church. This photo that's actually on the screen is actually at one of our partner churches in Baltimore City, Liberty Grace Church of God. And every time that we partner with the church, it is always women who stand up and answer the call to action to increase food security in their neighborhood, either by organizing a farmer's market or by establishing a community garden. And we have also identified that not only are they the ones who raise their hands first to say, yes, I will take on this mantle, but they are also the ones who carry the stories and the knowledge of their families, right? A lot of our elders within our community have roots from the Deep South, from South Carolina, and their family actually moved up during the Great Migration for better jobs and more opportunity, right? But when they moved, they kept their tradition. So this garden is actually named after Mama Newell, Mother Newell's nursery is what they call it, because she has opened this space up for the youth in the community to learn from her. And she is very interested in flower arrangements and pollinator gardens. So now she's interested in holding classes to pass down this tradition to younger generations. So to wrap up what I just said, also there's this quote by Ella Baker. It says, strong people don't need a strong leader. And I think like Mother Newell Nursery is an example of that. In the spirit of asset-based community development, we have the talents, we have the knowledge, we have the resources within our community. But what we have to do is just activate that within the people who we are in partnership with.
The only thing I'll add to that beautiful response is, we all in the Black community come through Black mothers. And in utero, as a public health person, I'm thinking about, like Freddie Gray was actually, him and his twin sister, they were exposed to lead in utero, because their mother had been poisoned by lead. And so I think that, it behooves us to center Black women in this regard and to think about, if we improve and design communities and make sure that people have, food security, make sure people have, healthy communities, clean air, green infrastructure, access to capital. If we make sure that Black women and Black mothers are protected with great resource access, like I'm describing, then we're going to have a healthier community, a thriving community overall. So I think, just from that health perspective, I think we have to rethink and be very focused on that sort of intersectional lens that concentrates at the womb in utero, when actually so many of our babies are being either poisoned or affected, before they even are born. So I think that's the only thing I would add. Oh, and then of course, maternal mortality, infant mortality, those things, fit right in with what's happening in the womb, and then also after birth. A lot of Black mothers died disproportionately. Black babies died disproportionately. So again, that's why I'm saying focusing on Black mothers, is really what help us get through and around and over those health disparities.
So now I want to open up the opportunity. If any participants have a question, you can write your question down in the chat room, and I will speak it out loud. So let's see if we have any questions now or not. And okay. Okay, yes, we'll share the maps.
Yeah, I wonder if too we could do a follow-up question on maps, because that is so important.
Yeah.
The role of maps in the city. And I wonder too, because we've been talking a lot about like digital technologies in some of my courses, a lot about how digital technologies are transforming the city, for better and worse, in some regards. But I wonder too, I guess this could go to Dr. Brown too, talking about maps and how you see digital technologies. Do you see them like reinstating or reinscribing or making these maps more static, adding more, I guess, doubling down on some of this map? Or do you see digital technologies as offering opportunities to kind of reshape these maps, to create multivariate, multi-leveled maps? Because I'm thinking about like GIS maps, and how GIS maps have often been used to change our kind of understandings of the city and to reorientate how we see the city.
Actually, I'm gonna let Siobhan answer that first. She has that urban planning degree, so I know she can answer that really well.
Yeah, that would be great.
If you want to, I don't want to hand it off if you don't want to.
Yeah, that's fine. I guess for me, of course, I'm all about participatory planning, human-centered design. So for me, it's not necessarily about the maps that are being created, right? It's about the data that's informing those maps. Like what metrics, who are defining the metrics and the data points that are feeding into these maps? Because I have some reservation in regards to the healthy food priority area map. I genuinely feel like these maps don't tell the full story of food insecurity and food apartheid in Baltimore City. As like the different metrics that I spoke of, predatory marketing is not included in the healthy food priority area map. Corner store saturation is not included in the map, right? Life expectancy is not included in the map. Different like diabetes is not included in the map, right? Also, lead poisoning is not included in the map. If the land is even farmable, is not included in the map, right? So I think it's a question of what data is being informed to create these maps, to tell the full story of the lived experiences of the people who are in these communities. I am actually involved in a mapping project in Cherry Hill, which is led by Black Yield Institute. And we are working to map food apartheid in Baltimore City. And we are using a participatory approach to define the data metrics that will inform these new maps to tell the full story of food apartheid and to further illustrate what food apartheid looks in Baltimore City and specifically in Cherry Hill. Because sometimes these maps are very limited in the scope and what is revealed by the maps. But I believe if you open it up and have more of a human-centered design approach, then it will be more holistic in sharing the lived experience of Black Baltimoreans simply.
That's great.
Yeah, that's why I wanted her to answer first, because I knew it would be great. And that's exactly what I was thinking, which is, there's a statement normally masculinized, he who has the goal makes the rules. I argue that he or she or they who controls the map determines the future for a city. And, this is the map that Siobhan was talking about earlier. This is that pivotal map for Baltimore City, the residential security map. And you can faintly see that boundary of Baltimore that goes around like this. But red, blue, yellow, and green, this map dictated which neighborhoods received access to capital. And this was created on May the 1st, 1937. So 80 plus years ago, the federal government, along with the city of Baltimore and state real estate assessors, they were determining, they had the map that created the environment that helped create. And then over time, as more Black people moved into the city, then you have a lot of these communities here flip and become red or yellow if you were to recategorize them today. So, the butterfly spreads, but you can see the lungs of the butterfly right here in 37. It's already there. So I think that goes to the point. They weren't planning with the community. They weren't planning, not the Black community. They weren't planning for the Black community. They were doing it. They were inflicting their designs for the city onto that map. And so that's what I think. I think the community has to have their own maps. Black communities have to have their own maps, come up with their own designs, so that when the planners come, when the city council member come, you pull out your map. Now, y'all brought a map to us. Well, we've got our own map and we want to show it to you. Yeah. And this is our vision. This is what we want. And use that, your own community control mapping process, design process, human-centered design. That's what has to happen. And I think that's what hasn't happened historically.
Yeah, so digital technologies might offer the opportunity for communities to do just that.
Possibly, but remember, there's a digital divide as well.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's racism in planning. There's racism in who has access to digital technology. Right here in Baltimore, we're dealing with the pandemic. Children during the time when they were learning at home, everybody didn't have Wi-Fi. That wasn't equally distributed Wi-Fi access. So, I mean, that's the thing, like, digital sounds good, but there's also, what my sister, Dr. Ruha Benjamin at Princeton, calls the Jim Crow, or what's she call it? The Jim Crow code, that you just have that, you have this, look at Google, Twitter, Facebook, their Black employees are like 2% of their workforce population, even though African Americans are like 13% of the population. So there's no digital panacea, because in fact, digital technologies often automate racism and put it in the background where you can't even see it, because there's an algorithm of oppression. That's because the designer, the coder, is encoding their racism into, they're not looking at their bias. And so racism gets buried in the algorithm. So the digital domain actually intensifies and hides, it obscures, it buries, deepens, speeds up racism. And so I think that's the thing when I think about the digital component of it. I think Dr. Sophia Noble's, her book, Algorithms of Oppression, so that's the type of thing. I think Dr. Ruha's book is Race After Technology. I have it right here. So, that's the thing that I think reading their works helps us to think through how the digital domain is often not the friend for the Black community that it should be, for all the reasons I laid out.
I think we have some questions in the chat. I guess I can read them. I'll go with first. So we have a question from Harold. So could y'all say a little more about both the negative roles that religions and our spirituality have played in creating segregated and unequal neighborhoods, and the positive roles they've played in addressing these inequities? Maybe Siobhan first.
Yeah, I think I can start off with the positive, because I have heard one of Dr. Brown's presentation where he talked about the negative. So I'll let him do that piece. I would definitely say that a positive is like the Black Church Food Security Network, right? We are empowering churches to reimagine their assets for community food security, right? Some people, surface level, right? That may look like a community garden. That also may look like a farmer's market in the parking lot, but we're going deeper than that. Mm-hmm. What we are saying is the church is a socioeconomic institution, a long-standing independent socioeconomic institution that could be leveraged to change the material conditions of the Black community. I am a product of two HBCUs, Tuskegee University and Morgan State University. Tuskegee University has roots from the Black church. Pastors coming together to say, hey, we need this. Same thing with Morgan State University. Pastors coming together in Baltimore say, we need a university for our students. So we are in that same tradition. And what we are doing is instead asking churches, do you have a commercial kitchen? Do you know the many uses of this commercial kitchen as it relates to food security? You can have food demonstrations. You can serve as an incubator kitchen for caterers and food makers. Oh, do you have a dining hall? Do you know what your dining hall could be used for? Okay, what about your members? You know, your members just come every Sunday and then they come to church, go home, or they watch online now. Okay, so what do they do during the week? Oh, they're accountants, they're herbalists, they're doctors. Okay, so how can we create a food health ministry or a health ministry that creates like diets based on our culture? Because I think what the mainstream food justice movement has done, it has defined what healthy food look like for us. Mm. It has said kale is the way to go. Kale is the superfood. Blueberries, the superfood. Ignatia, yes, get that, right? But what we are doing instead is saying, okay, so watermelon, like Siobhan, your uncle made you eat that every day. Do you know why? Do you know that watermelon is packed with electrolytes? Mm-hmm. Do you know how much water it packs in it, right? Mm-hmm. Also, like collard greens. Do you know that our ancestors used to boil collard greens, and then of course they would eat the greens, but the water that used to stay in the pan, in the pot, they would use that as like a drinking syrup. So when they had an upset stomach, they would drink it. So that is the power that we are organizing within the church. It's like we're leveraging the human resources, the stories, and we're also leveraging those physical resources and assets to advance community food sovereignty as defined by each community. So we work with churches to do just that. So we're in Baltimore, we have partners in Georgia, but we're not saying what Georgia churches should be doing. Instead, we like, okay, we have the resources, we have the technical assistance. Oh, do you want to do build a food ecosystem here? Okay, so let's have community planning meetings and we will support you. We will be the wind beneath your sails as you do that.
And that is the beautiful side of the church. But I got to talk about the negative side of the church. No. For 1 second, the negative side, in particular the white church. I'm going to show you right here. Look at this. This is from the 19-teens. You had churches that were supporting segregation. Uh-huh. They signed the segregation pact right here. And you see the names of the churches in Baltimore. Franklin Street Methodist Episcopal, St. Pius Catholic, Memorial United Evangelical, and Concordia Evangelical Lutheran. So you had these churches that were supporting racial segregation. They were afraid of the quote unquote Negro invasion. You see this phrase in the Baltimore Sun. then you see in this letter, the Mount Royal Improvement Association, where Bolton Hill is located today, Reservoir Hill is located today. They were meeting 1929 to support racial segregation. They had made their district safe for white occupancy by the sufficient number of the association's protective agreements. Those are those racially restrictive covenants I mentioned earlier. And here they are meeting at Associate Congregational Church. They're meeting at the church. And then this letter I found in the Baltimore City archives. These 5 churches wrote Mayor Howard Jackson to lobby for racial segregation. And look they wrote this and they said, in the form of a church resolution, whereas the said invasion of the Negro race by the Negro race, if allowed to continue on said Madison Avenue, will unquestionably within a short period of time destroy both the financial value of said church properties and the religious usefulness of said churches in said communities. So they're saying if the Negroes move in, our churches, the value of our church properties and the religious work that we do is going to be destroyed. And these are those 5 churches that said that. So, and then this is the last thing, the Ku Klux Klan had a church. Oh my goodness. The Ku Klux Klan had a church in Hartford County, Maryland. 1924, you had the Grand Dragon, the Kleagles, the Titans, the Cyclopses, and somewhere in here, the mayor for Havre de Grace, he tells them, anything I can do to help y'all, I will do that. Anything I can do. And so, and the Baltimore Sun writes it up. So the church, oh my goodness, the church, the white church in particular, the racist white church, the raggedy and racist white church, helped put Baltimore apartheid and racial segregation into effect. And so I think that's the other side of the story, the positive contribution of religion that Siobhan mentioned, and then the negative contribution of religion as you see in those documents.
I couldn't help but notice that the first newspaper article, Dr. Brown, you showed, it also said the hospital approves the plan as well.
Oh yeah, and so my field gets in there too, public health.
And right before that, Siobhan was talking about the health benefits of watermelon that oftentimes get forgotten by talking too much about kale. And so really, we're not just talking about contesting visions of religion, but also religion vis-a-vis medicine. There's Black church of model of health, and then there's this, I don't know, hospital / these churches pro-segregation model of health, and they're at loggerheads with each other. So there's certain, the paradox being that the city's vision of health was creating a lot of sickness for its African-American residents. I mean, that is something we got to come to grips with, and that's one of the great, I think, contributions of this discussion. I just want to quickly go over, one student had a question. Zach was wondering how stuff happening in Baltimore has had, is similar to or has had an effect on other cities. So maybe Dr. Brown, if you have some thoughts about some other areas as well, the sister cities that you want to quickly mention.
Well, the biggest thing is that Ferguson and Baltimore were actually the prelude. They were the warning signs. Our cities were the warning signs for America in terms of what happened after George Floyd was murdered. But we have to remember we had Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor earlier in 2020. So by the time Memorial Day rolled around and George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis PD, Black America and a lot of white Americans, we were ready to tear the roof off the sucker, because Baltimore and Ferguson and other cities like St. Louis, Milwaukee, Baton Rouge had already had uprisings between 2014 and 2018. So our cities were sending a warning signal to America. Hey, this thing is, y'all are raggedy and racist. Hyper-policing Black neighborhoods, hyper-policing Black and brown communities and people. And, Sandra Bland, so many, Miriam Carey and Ayanna Stanley Jones in Detroit. So many Black girls, Black women, Black men, Black boys, Black people of all genders were being put in harm's way before what happened to George. If America had listened to Baltimore and Ferguson, then it could have avoided the Great Rebellion, or the second wave of the Great Rebellion, as I call it in my book, which is the uprisings after the death of George Floyd. So I think That's what Baltimore was actually the warning sign. America, listen, this thing is real. You need to do something. And it didn't listen. And we reaped what we sowed.
Oh, you're silenced, but I wonder if you could follow up too, Siobhan, and talk more too about the Black Church Food Security Network and how it expands outside of Baltimore.
Yes, so last summer we issued a call to action. We called church leaders, we called church pastors, members, deacons, all of them, to connect back to agriculture by promoting gardening, patronizing Black farmers, because that's an entirely separate conversation about how farmers have been impacted due to racist policy, and to practice emergency food storage. And last summer, over 30 churches answered the call to action. So we have a network of churches as far south as Florida, Jacksonville. We have a budding cluster of churches in Atlanta, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Omaha, Nebraska, as well as Dallas, Texas. Wow. So we are working with those churches to co-create their community-based food systems. So far, they have agreed to starting a community garden. And we see that as being an on-ramp to our work. So the first thing first is start a community garden, right? Grow food that's culturally appropriate to your congregants as well as to your neighbors. And then second part, like, let's quantify our assets. How can we work collectively together to advance food sovereignty and to create a sustainable and equitable food system?
That's awesome. Yeah, great work. Fantastic. Yeah, I guess, do you want to finish it up? I think your mic.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. So I don't have the access to screen share right now, but that's okay. No biggie at all. What I'll do instead is just read out the question. So we have 24 participants with us. I think 4 of us is us, maybe 20 remaining. So for the patients, those who have been able to stay very patient, we got this book and I plan to have this book circulate. I'm going to finish reading, write a little review, add it to our podcast when we're all done. But then I'm going to mail it out to someone lucky enough to have answered the question correctly as quickly as possible. Okay, so I'll read this question out. It's just a fill in the blank, and the participants, which happens to be everybody who didn't, the folks who are attending and listening in, you guys can participate. I'll read out the question and you got to answer the fill in the blank. All right, so the question is as follows: Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, Flint, St. Louis, Cleveland, Birmingham, and Milwaukee. These are examples of hyper-segregated blank cities. Hyper-segregated blank cities. And the correct answer is also category 5, but since that's already been mentioned, that's not the answer I'm looking for. There's another word I'm looking for. So let's see if someone can get it right. I'll repeat: Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, Flint, St. Louis, Cleveland, Birmingham, and Milwaukee are examples of hyper-segregated blank city. Let's see if someone can fill in the blank there.
I think I was able to switch back control for you.
Okay, great. Red line, close, but not the answer I'm looking for. Let's see. Chat room. Go try medicine. It's not the answer. Let me give a hint. The word is synonymous with subway. Subway, synonymous with subway. Another hint, it's a geographic term. You'll see it in geography. Let's see if someone can get it right. There it is. We got a winner. Kayla Tester, you have won the prize. Examples of hyper-segregated metropolitan cities. And I just want, it's a kind of a boring sounding term, but it's actually a really key term. One way I understood Dr. Brown's work is he's giving us an explanation of how the metropolitan city causes health issues for its African American residents. So I think that's one of the ways to kind of approach this book too. So Kayla, what you got to do, Kayla, is, as I've said it in this, just go to send me an email, sherafgan.tareen@morgan.edu with the recipient's name and the mailing address you want this to be mailed at, and I will do so next week. So my email address is as follows: sherafgan.tareen@morgan.edu. All right, team. So I want to just finish off today's thing with just a couple of more slides. I'm quickly going to go through them very fast within 2 minutes. So we'll be done in 2 to 3 minutes. But this is really for the participants who came and heard Dr. Brown and Siobhan talk. So there are many things you guys can do. One is community engagement. Well, first thing is you can follow our guest. All right. So the Black Church Food Security Network has a really robust Facebook page that I found just a few minutes before we started the discussion. And Dr. Brown has the Black Butterfly Project, and that has a website too. So you can follow our guest. Another thing you can do is you can connect Black farmers to Black churches and other supportive institutions. So in the Black Church Food Security Network webpage, there is a directory that can be quite conducive. If you know of Black farmers who in your area, that's another thing you can do. Another point is this building kinship with the Black seed. Oftentimes when we think about kinship is an expansive term. It means more than just blood or genetic relationship. And the Black seed, we think about ownership, we usually think about possession, but here it's really important to think about relationship, right? So see what people are writing under the Black Church Food Security Network reflection papers. It's a fabulous paper about the history of the Black seed and its value as something owned, but also something to whom you relate to. So what does that mean to be in a kinship with that? You guys can be in a kinship with the Black seed as well. Secondly, in terms of your research, a lot of your students, I can see there's plenty you can do to design your research projects centered around the question of food sovereignty and environmental health. So you can visit our Religion in Cities podcast series. In that podcast series, you will find the recording of this episode, but you'll also find recording of the 5 episodes we did last semester when we invited scholars who have written a book on health and disease. That can be your secondary resources as you kind of design whatever research you want to engage in. You can read those books, you can listen to those podcasts. You can also follow us on YouTube. Another thing you can do is you can design research projects on the interplay between the human experience, religion, and medicine. And this is a really key thing I wanted to talk about because I come from a family of doctors, and my mom would always say growing up that doctors are nothing more than just people who repair the human body. And she kind of did that to kind of quash the mystique of a doctor, and definitely doesn't show too much reverence to the field of medicine. But she would say that because she felt frustrated by the ways in which her field didn't prepare her to actually talk about the human experience and just made her a repairman at the end of the day. And she felt frustrated by that. So one of the initiatives of this podcast is to really challenge the binary between the humanities and medicine. It's a binary that is very prevalent across institutions of higher ed, and we want to kind of challenge that, and this is a platform to do so. And we have a lot of archives of interviews that we conducted with people who received, were beneficiaries of a COVID relief fund. These are our community partners of the Center for Religion in the City. You can look at all those interviews that were collected. That can be an archive source for you by going to the Religion and Cities page. And as Dr. Brown has already done, offered us, immersed us into this great digital archives. That's a great thing you can do to go to the Black Butterfly Project. There's all these fabulous archives, these digital archives that you can use in your research as well. I can see Dr. Morales has stuff written here too about community control of land, the people's demand for land reparations in Baltimore City. So he's sending this some links also under the Google chat, under the Zoom chat. And lastly, apply for the Csrc Research Summer Grant. I mean, this is a grant we offer annually. So once you have a robust research design, you can do that. And, you know, this can be useful for you for your capstone papers, but it can also be useful for you for graduate school applications and other kinds of jobs you may apply for down the road. So this is one of the things we wanted to kind of talk about, bringing humanities and medicine together, because I sense that is the future going forward. So that is it.
For more information about what you can do to get involved in your community and make change, visit the Religion in Cities podcast webpage at religionancities.org/podcast.